Could you tell a little bit about the very beginnings of the new Alchemy Institute, how it all started?
Shall I?
Madame.
Well, it was right about the time of, 1970 and just before, when people were there was a new wave of environmental awareness. Paul Ehrlich had published The Population Bomb. There was a lot of people beginning to talk about the environment and read about the environment. And we were living in San Diego in California, and John and his colleague Bill McClarney and others were starting to listen to what people were saying, and we became concerned and thought we ought to learn more. So we started to hold sort of evening seminars in our living room, and we talked for a long time about all that was going wrong, lead from car exhausts in the air supposing to cause brain damage in children, nitrate from fertilizers leaching into the ground and also affecting the health of children through groundwater. And we got tired of just what John and Bill called doom watching, documenting everything that was going wrong, and started to ask ourselves, can we do anything about it? And became clear to us that we didn't know whether we could create change, but we thought we should try. So we started New Alchemy with the question, is it possible for the present human population to live sustainably on the planet without creating, ongoing damage to natural systems? And we founded the Institute and then decided we had to find out. So that's why we moved across the country to Cape Cod and rented 12 acres of land and proceeded to undertake really serious experiments in food and energy and architecture, looking for alternatives.
Great. And at what stage did you really gain sort of public recognition and
Traction,
media
so to
attention?
speak?
Well, early on, and it probably was not a good thing in the long run, because we probably got the idea that anything we decided we would do, we could do quickly and easily. People started to, we had barely planted our first gardens before people started to arrive in considerable numbers, and within a few years by the thousands.
Yeah.
Every week, up to 10,000 visitors.
But there's a reason for it. We were, even though we barely had traction, we were publishing really creative visions and designs and ideas and telling the world, this is what we're going to do.
Mm-hmm. That's
true.
true.
And it was kind of bold. We said we're going to restore the lands, protect the seas,
and inform the earth stewards. That's my job.
Stewards, and we really went dead at it. And I think one of the advantages we had is both Bill and I were doom-watch scientists, so we could see the unraveling of the natural world through a very long telescope. I mean, I had found that the social communication signals in fishes could be disrupted by agricultural chemicals 3 and 4 orders of magnitude more dilute than lethal levels. Could, in essence, virtually eliminate them without killing them. And because the parents, instead of nurturing their young, would eat the young. That's pretty... so we knew that we had to go dead at these problems. One thing that we did have was the broad canvas roadmap that Stuart Brand was putting together with the Whole Earth Catalog, where he set out, as Diderot did in France centuries earlier, to sort of reorganize knowledge around some kind of new paradigm. And the paradigm he chose was the work of the systems thinker Gregory Bateson and the work of the arch designer Buckminster Fuller. And then he grafted on that the sort of the wisdom and sensibility of people like Rachel Carson and other people
René Dubose.
and René Dubose, who were very, very earth in tune with the earth and its needs. So it was a moment.
Who, if you had to name 3 or 4 or 5 people who really deeply influenced your work and kind of put you on your way? Who would these people be?
Oh, Nancy, you start.
Well, certainly Gregory Bateson. Certainly Stuart Brand, William Irwin Thompson, definitely. Perhaps I'd put William Irwin Thompson first. Margaret Mead. And Stuart Brand, if I didn't say Stuart Brand.
Yeah. Well, for me, it was catalyzed by some of the ecological writers and thinkers, and perhaps one of the most profound was H.T. Odum. When in his little book Energy, Power, and Society, he said, "Why don't we rethink life in such a way that we can create a new partnership?" And then he went on to make the outrageous statements: is that life forms are just simply a vast bin of spare parts for us to utilize in the creation of ecological technologies that won't harm the earth. And I liked that. That had a lot of horsepower behind it. But we were also driven by a lot of the social forces, including, the brothers Goodwin in Communitas and the writings I'm talking about me, and Prince Kropotkin's writing. I had a lot of fascination by that. Also, the Joseph Needham Science and Civilization in China was a big influence on me. They're just all over the place. I was completely omnivorous about trying to integrate knowledge and seeking sources from everywhere. I think Nancy's named the key players, and then I've added the sort of the deep technological in the case of Joseph Needham, and scientific, ecological in the case of Odum, but there are many others, including my professors as a doctoral student.
You yesterday you mentioned Gregory Bateson referring to your work as, now there's an epistemology with a future.
Oh man!
Could you tell that story again, and also which particular bit of the work was he referring to?
I'll get Nancy to tell you the story, but basically I presented our work to a Lindisfarne gathering at the very early days of Lindisfarne, and Gregory was there.
Yes, and interestingly, John directly followed after Fritz Schumacher. So, as one of our colleagues said, John was set up like a golf ball on a tee, because Schumacher had a lot of the, was it in Burma that he did a lot of his work? He had a lot of examples from elsewhere, but then John came on with slides at that time, not a PowerPoint, and had slides of everybody doing exactly what, at New Alchemy, exactly what Fritz had said people should do. And so there we were, creating small, healthy local economies, growing our own food, looking for alternative renewable energy sources, building windmills, and obviously having a good time. And so when John finished, Gregory, who was a great bear of a fellow, kind of trumpeted and went, "Well now, there's an epistemology with a future."
We were mighty pleased.
Yes, that was it. That felt us, if we'd ever had any self-doubt, which we really didn't, that would have erased it. That was just wonderful.
I think one of the reasons why we didn't have a ton of self-doubt is that our work was really very romantic in the aesthetic and cultural sense. We were, sort of like Gary Snyder's "To Be Truly Alive" is to be on the transforming energy side. That poem for
It's
change.
tremendous fun.
Yeah. It was also stressful but fun.
Where did the term New Alchemy arise, and could you say a little bit more about why you chose that?
It chose us.
It chose us.
Yes, it really did. We had been puzzling over a name, all kinds of things, sustainable this, and really quite boring, non-memorable names. And then one night, I remember it so clearly, John stuck his head around the kitchen door. We hadn't been talking about anything. Stuck his head around the kitchen door and said, "New Alchemy?" And I said yes. It was just so clear. So it was his idea, and it worked.
And I know where the well springs came from it because our knowledge of alchemy came later. I was looking at an Arts Canada art magazine, and there were these little paintings on stones that had been placed in, I think, Vancouver Island. And there was a little caption saying, modern day alchemy. And then months later, this popped out of my mouth.
And it was mainly the two of you and Bill McClarney who started
Yes,
New Alchemy.
exactly.
You also moved over from California to
to Cape Cod.
To Cape Cod.
As did Bill. Yes.
And how long did Bill stay with New Alchemy and before he moved to Costa Rica?
Oh, he stayed for many, many years, well into the 80s.
Yeah, and he stayed as long as we did. His work in Costa Rica was New Alchemy in Costa Rica,
Yeah.
and it's called ANAI is
Associación de, you could probably say New Alchemy better than we can.
yeah.
Alchemia Nueva.
Yes.
Yeah, and he liked it because serendipitously it also means hope in the Bribri native language. So he always saw himself as an extension of our work.
Oh yeah.
In Costa Rica, and we supplied him with lots of interns and talent that were nurtured here and then went to help him there.
Or went for a semester or so to spend down there. It's a hugely successful project too. Hugely successful. One of the UN sees it as one of the best models for development, period. He's done a tremendous amount of good work.
Yeah.
And the project on Prince Edward Island also gave you a lot of publicity. How did that start, and how did you find the funding for it? And
it was the UN Year of Habitat. Barbara Ward had announced some new vision of human settlements at a UN meeting in Vancouver, British Columbia, and so the Canadian government was open to new ideas for a short period of time. And so I approached Environment Canada, and after a series of meetings and proposals, the idea of an ark on Prince Edward Island was finally approved and funded, and we started the designing and the trek. And then most of us came from New England to Prince Edward Island, and then of the group that worked on it, the majority stayed there to live the rest of their lives and continue the work. So it was a relatively short-lived project, probably no more than 5 years, but it incubated a whole new generation of people in Canada that have done remarkable work.
Could you describe the idea of the bioshelter a little?
A bioshelter is really a home for life, diverse life.
If you were to envision a greenhouse that was ecologically designed in the sense that it was protected from the north and open to the south and received a lot of solar energy, but then your standard greenhouse has to use rather chemical management, just, pesticides and that sort of thing. There were never any. So it was a place to grow food, and then when we added in terms of vegetables, fruits, and also raised fish, and very, very wonderfully fertile environment that we could ripen tomatoes without any fossil fuel heat in February in a well-designed greenhouse. But the one in Prince Edward Island had the added dimension. It was also a house or home, so there were living quarters. So that added a whole new dimension of how to supply sufficient energy from the wind and the sun to not only provide a workspace and a growing space, but living space.
It also had research space with offices and computers and things like that. So it served a number of functions. I think the breakthrough with the bioshelters was the proof that one could take agricultural ecosystems and move them indoors and allow them to self-regulate and self-design and protect themselves from disease and pests. and we assembled the ecology, and it really was a very collective effort. No single person knew exactly how to do it. There would be people working with IPM, integrated pest management, other people working with companion planting, other people working with, one of my special contributions was the creation of little ecological islands, what ecologists call refugia, where beneficial organisms would be present in the system, but not the kind of beneficial organisms that most horticulturalists think of. They were things like creatures like dragonflies and damselflies that live in water. So there would be little pools amongst the things. So that was my personal contribution. And then there were others who looked at which kind of flowers had to be mixed with the crops in order that the predatory insects would have a feed source to feed on pests. In other words, it was really a superb example of different kinds of intelligence working in a given space to create a whole system.
Including natural intelligence.
Including natural intelligence.
But what is important, I think that John often made the point that it was the, now 21st equivalent of a barn, where, things were stored to weather out the cold season. And now with peak oil approaching and climate change a good possibility, I think it's even more important, because people are going to need to produce much more food locally and regionally. And this is a way of continuing to grow. For instance, in an urban context, you could have one every few blocks or in every neighborhood where people could have year-round community gardens. So they have application, I think, even more now. And so much of what we were doing years ago as experimental is now becoming a necessity. So the times have caught up with us.
And the early aquaculture experiments with Bill McClarney and you, growing fish in these large vats, eventually turned into productive living machines. And then at some point you also decided to see if these could be used to clean up water. Could you describe
describe the tanks first?
Yeah, how that... well, we honored sunlight as a primary organizing principle. We created tanks that had clear sides so that in 3 dimensions sunlight could penetrate them. And then we built ecosystems we assembled ecosystems within them, and then began to create food chains that would produce fish, and as a byproduct of the filtration of the fish water, also vegetables and greens and things like that. So again, here is this process of capturing sunlight, of designing food webs, of trying to incorporate many of the different kingdoms of life into a single space so that they could integrate, led to first some theories about ecological design, which got published quite a bit later, and then moved from food production out into worrying about problems of pollution and waste and toxic environments. And that led to another level of attempting to work in an even more complex way with natural systems, and spent probably a decade trying to figure out how to work with toxic waste and sewage and septage and industrial waste and so on. And eventually the pieces began to fall together, so that by getting on toward the middle of the 1990s, the theoretical foundations for it had been laid out. And then after that period, we then began to look at how we could reassemble that knowledge again and create what we call agricultural eco-parks, so that you bring different disparate activities together, like baking and brewing and sauce making and restaurants, and you combine those with new product development, including agricultural products. And so there is a continuum that began, I would say, with some of McClarney's ponds in his basement to the first solar ponds that I created here, all the way to where we're at now, which is more years later than over 30 years. And so now we're beginning to think about even transforming existing processes like sewage treatment plants into sewage farms that will grow higher plants, botanicals, that will provide us with the biodiesel energy we need in the future. In other words, why throw away all the energy and nutrients that's in human waste? Why not redirect it into a pathway that's applicable to a era of possibly scarcities and disruptions? So there's I think that I can see a continuum, and I've never really written about it, from my first experiments at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, where I tried to create simulated tropical marine environments in a greenhouse on Cape Cod, and began to develop for the first time a science of ecological assembly. In other words, where I took pieces and elements from the edge of the sea and put them in a greenhouse, that I then was able to create whole environments that allowed tropical fishes that I was studying to actually breed in those buildings. And breeding marine fishes is not easy. And it was just so exciting to see this kind of assembly. And of course, again, all these influences that were coming in at this time, and still are. I was very impressed with Levi-Strauss's book, The Raw and the Cook, and the idea of the bricoleur, the enlightened tinkerer who finds, whatever it is around he or she, and to create something marvelous out of what most people would see as junk. And I thought that the same kind of thinking could be applied to living forms, ecological elements.
Is this for you the birth of ecological design, and how would you define ecological design?
For me it was, and I was slow to realize what I was doing. But I had a sense of where I was headed. Well, as far as I'm concerned, ecological design is tapping into nature's operating instructions and applying what it knows and how it does things and in what ways it accomplishes its ends, which are so much more efficient than anything we can engineer on our own, and also less destructive, and then direct it, and this is the design part, direct it towards solving a human need, whether it's food or fuels or environmental repair or
energy.
Waste conversion or energy. So, or all of these combined.
And you were both involved in the Adam Joseph Lewis Center, that collaborative design process. Were you not, just John?
Just John.
In the collaborative design process that created the building, could you say a little bit about that process?
Well, I was certainly present, but I was a very minor actor on a very exciting stage.
Well, though, the New Alchemy ideas certainly were the original model. It's a big bioshelter, really, or ark. And we both went and spoke at Oberlin and showed a lot of slides. Yeah. So that, to that degree,
it influenced the students.
Yes, exactly.
And basically, the David Orr, who was the impresario professor, who was the conductor of it all, made some very early on decisions, which I think made the project more exciting for some of us, at least. And that was he intended to include his students and the staff and the faculty in the design. So it was a process that was not driven by the experts, you know, the grand architect or the brilliant engineer or the wicked ecological designer. It was all done in a process, and it was fascinating to watch. Normally, experts who are used to telling people how to do things to have to be part of a iterative, collaborative process. And that was David's genius, and he had the patience to put up with different people from different directions at different speeds coming into the process. And I think there are very few people at that time who understood the collective design and the stakeholder involvement in design. And I must say I've learned a lot about it in recent years, but it really did come out of working with students on design projects and working in a project like Oberlin.
And you're currently at the University of Vermont, and there's a number of future visioning processes going on there. What's your vision for the University of Vermont, and also for this newly to be established Journal of Ecological Design?
Well, I've looked at it in three ways. First is the idea of retrofitting badly designed older buildings into very green, biologically friendly buildings, which we're trying to do at the Rubenstein School for the Environment and Natural Resources. And that whole process of re-envisioning what an existing building could be has been just really remarkable. I can see what it would be like to walk through it 10 years from now. I have it all in my head, thanks to a design process of the kind I've just talked about. The other thing is that I would really like to see is if the university is bold enough to go from 2006, December 2006, to June of 2022 and transform itself into a carbon neutral institution, no longer dependent on fossil fuels for its functioning. And to do so, it would also transform how universities teach literacy, including ecological literacy, and how they teach skills. Universities tend to be clusters of little silos with their own dimensions and rarely cross the boundaries.
It's also very important to a lot of organic food and locally produced food is only just beginning to penetrate the university system. I think Yale now has one of its cafeterias or dining halls, which is all organic, and it's very, very popular. Largely the students have been subsisting on little better than junk food, and it's often run by one of the big food producing corporations, and that is gradually the food producing corporations are starting to pay attention to the need for local and organic food, but that's a high priority as well, and it's beginning to happen. And that too for the University of Vermont, seeing local food, and Vermont is so amazingly good and available.
Yeah.
And Nancy, you've been a writer, an editor, and publisher for a long part of the last 35 years. And you started off with the Journal of the New Alchemists, and then Annals of Earth,
yes.
And you've both written a number of books together. You recently published a book. Could you say a little bit about your career as a writer? And
well, first of all, practically, it was something I could do at home when my children were small, and I wanted not to be away all the time when my kids were little. And secondly, I'm not a scientist. So I really didn't feel qualified to do a lot of the work that was being done both at Ocean Arcs and at New Alchemy, but I could write about it. And I figured by my writing about it, I could explain it in a way to people who also weren't familiar with the science. Because I wasn't, you know how any established group has its own sort of language and way of communicating among the members. Well, seeing I really wasn't a member of the scientific core, I could see the importance of what we were doing and then try and make that relevant to a reader who would be more in my state of not really understanding. I had to struggle to learn to understand about ecology and the interconnectedness of everything. I didn't grow up and wasn't educated with those common concepts at all. But now they seem to me as obvious as breathing.
Can you say a bit more about how you put the Journal of the New Alchemist together? And
Well, it was tremendous fun for starters. Well, what we did was basically look at everything that was going on at the Institute. You know, it ranged from gardening, composting, tree planting, fish raising, of course, and many, many different methods of it, and administration. And then people's other interests, such as Bill McLarney and Costa Rica, and ask everybody to make a contribution. But then if you just didn't both edit it but organize it in a certain way, it just came out as a bunch of stuff, you know. And so what I had to do was organize it into sections, and then after that introduce the journal as a whole, and then introduce each article so that people would see how they fit into the whole and why this particular work was, even though they have consisted of using pond water to water vegetables, to see how that fit into the whole picture.
And your recent book?
It's called A Safe and Sustainable World, The Promise of Ecological Design. The title was actually the publishers. I don't think I would have been that presumptuous, but they assured me that you have such a short time to catch the attention of somebody browsing in a bookstore that you had to have a title that grabbed them. And it basically is telling the history of both New Alchemy and Ocean Arcs, but because, as I said earlier, the time is so right. What we were doing then was experimental and useful and interesting, but now most of those ideas are a necessity. We have to be able to clean up our waste. We have to learn how to produce. Not food on the average travels over 1,000 miles to reach people. Peak oil with fossil fuel prices rising. We can't afford that. We can't afford it in terms of continuing to transport things the way we do because of climate change. So all that was ahead of its time is now practical and realistic.
And finally, what's your vision for the next 30 years in terms of what needs to happen on a local, regional, global scale in order for humanity to face that challenge that we have, transitioning into a sustainable human civilization? Are you hopeful, or do you think that we have to have an almost collapse before we can rebuild, or can we change the system from within?
I think we're well on the way. There's been tremendous, for instance, food I think is the rallying cry. The sort of most obvious, but also a lot of things are happening in the area of getting off fossil fuels. But particularly with food, I mean, the number of people who are changing not only their eating habits, their buying habits, the number of people who are organizing for to really change what people are called the food system from the current industrial-based one. The largest organization is called Slow Food. It's global, and it brings together, you know, farmers from Kenya and Rwanda with people from Bolivia, Europe, North America, and everybody. Somebody said, it's generating a force field, one reporter put it, around food issues, and it has mainstream writers involved, so the books are selling into the mainstream. So I think food is the most obvious one. I think we have to get off fossil fuels, period, as soon as possible. Go carbon neutral. I think we understand enough in terms of the technology and the knowledge to do it. I really do. And I think what's dragging us is the corporate nature of the global economy and the indifference of a lot of the people at the top to the changes that have to happen because they're still making money. But I think that it's a bottom-up movement, and I think it's well on its way. And I think if you look at the recent election in the United States, their changes are well underway. I think the sort of oil-dominated mentality has been dealt a blow and will continue to be dealt a blow.
How about you, John?
I don't know what percentage of the culture is sleepwalking into the future and don't foresee making major changes or adjustments. I really do believe that Nancy's right in that there's a lot of momentum being built up, and it is true that people are increasingly becoming aware that something has to happen, and rather dramatically. I think that Al Gore has done an excellent job of conveying the need to reduce the CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere if we're going to have a chance in snowball's chance in hell of getting through. I'm fascinated by the kind of countercurrent response to this, with ingenuity beginning to pop up everywhere. And it really is a horse race. It's not clear whether we will avert a crash. There have been people saying that you can't have a whole economic system based on growth forever. The planet can't take it, the system itself can't take it, the human beings can't take it. So it really is anybody's guess as to how the future is going to turn out. I think what I tell students, who are our most important asset, that they need to live as if they can make a difference in the transformation, because anything less than that would lead to despair and failure of this human enterprise, whatever one calls it. So on Mondays I'm optimistic, on Tuesdays I'm a pessimist, on Wednesdays I'm in despair, and by Thursdays I'm back being an optimist again. I'm a veritable roller coaster in this department.
Do you think that the Plant Journal of Ecological Design could have a role in communicating a hopeful vision, helping people to see that this transition is already happening and moving forward?
I think the publication, Ecological Design, if it formulates to use Gregory Bateson's phrase, an epistemology with a future, and conveys it in enough different ways, then I think it could have enormous influence.
I think it's essential.
Yeah, I think it's essential. If it merely sets out to talk to solely professionals and not decision makers, and not people from other sectors such as business or civic sectors, it won't do it. But if somehow the ecological design publications, and I said that in plural because I don't think there's a single way to communicate, and you also agree because otherwise you wouldn't have this camera here right now, it has an enormous possibilities for change, and I like the idea that it will be multilingual, even if only initially it's summaries, but to to have a publication in Spanish and French and English and Mandarin. It's kind of interesting. Maybe Swahili. Could be quite a force for good.
Thank you very much.